Welcome to the Postscript. Pastor Andrew here with Pastor Ian. And on this episode of the Postscript, we're going to be talking about Micah. Pastor Ian, you preached a wonderful sermon on the book of Micah. There's so much happening in Micah, and there's so many different sections and so many different transitions from one idea to another idea.
Yep.
I can imagine it was a hard sermon to put together just from the what theme are you going to get after, and when you're preaching 7 chapters, you really have to find kind of a groove and get into it.
Yes, whether I found the groove, I don't know. Yes and amen to those things. I'm going to turn the tables back on you, Pastor Andrew, on that because we sang a wonderful new song on Sunday.
Oh.
People aren't going to catch it on the podcast. They got to fight to show up to worship for that. But a King's Church original, Book of the 12. Speaking of themes and things going on,
Book of the 12.
I don't know if people knew, but I know you and the team have spent a lot of time on that. So It was better than my sermon, for sure. I just wanted to say thanks for that. And I don't know, any insight in how that came together as we talk about the themes in Micah? Because Micah really is it grabs almost all of the themes in the Minor Prophet and wraps it up in one. So I love that we introduced that song and you guys did such a great job. So turning the tables on you. Any thoughts on how that came together?
Yeah, the Postscript.
That's right.
The B-side of the Postscript.
Truly.
It was just the concept of the idea as we were looking for music to play during the series. Mm-hmm. There are so many good songs out there and not a ton that really line up with the Minor Prophets.
Yes.
And so Omnipotent has been one that we've been singing a little bit, which is, awesome and
strong.
Strong
to quite strong.
And and the idea for Book of the 12 was really what would it be like to really have every line pulled and hyperlinked from one of the Book of the 12. And kind of bringing all those together. And then, just the idea of, as the Lord is roaring from Zion, we are just rejoicing that he has come and he is coming, really being the climax of the song.
Yeah.
So, the team, really did an amazing job pulling it all together, and I'm looking forward. We're going to be singing it a couple more times throughout the series.
Yeah.
So hopefully it'll be an encouragement and in a way that as we're leaving on a Sunday morning, we can take home, the themes, the thoughts, the ideas from the scriptures in the Minor Prophets.
Yep.
And,
Yeah, man. Amen.
Yep.
Well, it was great. So just wanted to honor you. Thanks for your hard work in writing that and being a part of that with your team.
Thanks, brother.
And honestly, a lot of the stuff we sang in the song are in Micah because, like you said, Micah is covering a whole lot of ground. It was a hard sermon to preach because in Micah, if you're reading it, it's really hard to grab hold of exactly where you're at because it'll swing wildly from woes and judgment and kind of that prophetic warning that we see throughout all the Minor Prophets. That's all in here in Micah. But then it's immediately followed up by hope of a remnant and hope of God doing something new. And so the book it almost feels like a yo-yo as you're reading it. And so, maybe to give a little more context back into the sections we didn't cover, particularly in 1 through 5, 1 just kind of opens with this word of judgment against both Samaria and Jerusalem, as we said this morning, both the north
Idolatry,
and the south.
Just running amok.
Yeah, idolatry is all over the place. There's all sorts of rampant injustice. And at the end of 1 is kind of a fun little, it's got all these different places that he names, and they're kind of all play on words. The prophets, sometimes they were a little extra with their communication.
They say pun and get it.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
I might alliterate some sermons. They knew how to just slightly, play with words to really do that. So all of these places that are mentioned there, and then chapter 2 is really where he breaks into all of the specifics of kind of the sin and what's going on there. But just to give you an example of kind of this yo-yo, so you get to chapter 2. Let's pick it up maybe in verse 6. So there, these false prophets are saying this: "Do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us." They're basically saying, stop preaching what you're preaching. We got it under control. Us, we're keeping the status quo.
Yeah.
And then verse 7, "Should this be said, O house of Jacob, has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? But lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by trustingly, with no thought of war." Maybe a better translation there is, or returning from war, kind of refugees. "The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor forever." They're taking advantage of widows in that way. Verse 10, arise and go, for this is no place to rest because of the uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be a preacher for this people. So like, okay, heavy, heavy judgment. And then right in the middle of verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass the gate, going out by it. The king passes on before them, the Lord at their head.
Wow.
So all in those like little just 6 verses, it's like a whirlwind. You're like, okay,
Whiplash.
the Lord's, whiplash. He's bringing the judgment on the people, but yet there's just immediately this word of hope.
Yeah.
And this is really that theme of the day of the Lord played out in the whole book of Micah.
Yep.
It's okay, is it a day of judgment or is it a day of salvation?
Yep.
And the minor prophets say, yes.
Yes.
That's
Maybe
what
both.
it is. That's right.
Maybe both.
And that's where I think Micah's vision of the remnant, that's why I wanted to at least bring that point in today at the end, is really compelling because while the day of the Lord is a day both of judgment and one of salvation, the remnant will bring about, he will bring about a salvation through judgment for a remnant of his people.
Yeah.
And that remnant here in Micah will be shepherded by this king that is to come. And there's lots of rich stuff in that in the book.
That's going to come up time and time again throughout. I like how you said that it really draws together a lot of the themes. Like we've seen the theme of spiritual, like sometimes certain books in the Book of the 12 will focus in on spiritual idolatry.
Yeah.
And some focus in on, predatory economics like we've talked about. And Micah's going after both.
Yeah.
He's kind of just going after it all.
Yeah, it's not a short list.
Yeah.
I mean, first service, I read all the passages. Second service, I was like, that was too much to read. I mean, there's a lot that's there. Chapter 3 really is the summary. I mean, he really goes after the heads of Jacob. He goes after the false prophets. Like, if you're looking for, okay, what's really going on spiritually? Why is the Lord bringing his righteous judgment? I mean, chapter 3 kind of has it all. And I love, again, the turn from 3 to 4 is really beautiful. If I had to preach Micah a second time, I'd go back to 4. I think 4 is just beautiful. So at the end of 3, verse 12, after all of those lists of the indictment, that's coming, verse 12 says this, therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. Here, he's really foretelling the destruction of the temple that is to come. But then, just literally the next verse, chapter 4, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk, same verb we saw in 6:8, walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples. He shall decide disputes for strong nations far away, and they shall hear this promise of peace, beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. And no one shall make them afraid. Imagine the day. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken, for all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So, man, there's just this rich promise all throughout Micah of, yes, destruction is coming, but destruction is not the final word. Sin has consequences. I will pour out my righteous judgment. But through that, there's this better, more beautiful thing that is coming.
Yeah.
And that's the remnant. That's this promise of the nations coming to this king and this kingdom and this new temple. It's just really rich in a lot of eschatology type sense of the new creation that is to come.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really beautiful there in chapter 4, and even that last line I love. We will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever.
Yeah,
I love the walk is a kind of repeated word throughout the book.
Yeah,
and walking. I think of Psalm 1. I think of the Psalms. We're walking in paths of unrighteousness or righteousness.
That's right.
And kind of as we're reaping and as we're sowing, and yielding the fruit. But the question of course comes like at the end of or in the midst of chapter 4, how is that remnant, how's that judgment, salvation, day of the Lord actually going to come to pass?
Yeah.
In chapter 5.
Yeah.
is beautiful.
Yeah, you probably knew 2 verses in Micah. You probably knew Micah 6:8 if you
Yeah.
familiar with the Bible, and you definitely know Micah 5.
I saw it on a bumper sticker once.
Yeah. So Micah 5 is, just this beautiful prophecy of a ruler. And speaking of walking, there's no more type of walking activity than a shepherd
Yeah.
walking with his flock. And we've already seen it, that imagery of a shepherd and the flock of God shows up all throughout Micah. We'll see it right here in chapter 5 again. By the way, the context here in Micah, just to give a little more backdrop, his ministry spanned a wide frame, so I didn't want to spend too much time on that this morning. But this is on the early part of the minor prophets as far as chronology, and this is when Assyria is the superpower. And so they're coming in, they wipe out the northern kingdom, and they've surrounded Jerusalem. They're about to take them out. There's been wicked kings ruling over Judah in particular, but yet Micah is prophesying in the time of Hezekiah. Okay. And if you remember in the story of Hezekiah, he actually repents and he seeks the Lord's help. And an angel of the Lord wipes out the army of Sennacherib overnight. And so there is actually this sense of, okay, there's this looming threat that is surrounding us. And all of Micah's prophecies are kind of with that in mind. And so we see that in chapter 5. So verse 1 here, muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us, as in Assyria's coming. Yeah. Like they're on their way. With a rod, they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. It's kind of like it's almost a disrespectful kind of slap is the picture there. Yeah. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor is given birth, and the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. And listen to this, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. Beautiful promise. Bethlehem would have been known as being the birthplace of David. Right. And so we're connecting all of the messianic kingdom promises to David here with this ruler. But just like Micah's from a small town, this ruler, who, by the way, is from ancient days. Yeah. I mean, what a beautiful promise of the incarnation. Yeah. It can literally mean from everlasting. Yeah. So this ruler is like the once and future king. I think when I preach this in Advent, I've used that title. Yeah. And so he's this coming from old, and he's going to stand and shepherd the flock. Yeah. And if the threat of Assyria is there, but the threat of sin, death, and evil in an ultimate sense is looming in the backdrop of Assyria. Yeah. And there's one who is coming who's going to shepherd his flock in the strength of God. They're going to dwell secure. He will be their peace. All those promises of chapter 4 are only found because of his finished work. Yeah. Even though I stand in the presence of my enemies. That's right. I will fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, kind of like just a kind of a couple hyperlinks coming before David. Yeah. We're in Genesis in classes right now, and when the curse is given to woman, and it said that her pain or her toil will multiply in childbirth. Yeah. The next time that shows up in Genesis is Rachel dying, giving birth on the way to Bethlehem. Yeah. And so you already see this like longing and this expectation that something's coming from Bethlehem that we haven't seen before. Yeah. And then, of course, David comes through Bethlehem, and then all the promises given in the prophets of Bethlehem. Yeah. It's like building this scarlet thread through the scriptures of like something's coming from Bethlehem. That's right. Even Ruth, I mean, like we just preached through. So. Yeah, lots of hyperlinks there for sure. Yeah. And he picks up the shepherd imagery one more time in chapter 7, right before that beautiful ending. In verse 14, he says, shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, who dwell alone in the forest, in the midst of a garden land. Speaking of some Eden imagery there. As in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt, I will show them marvelous things. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths, their ears, and shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. Oh, gosh, Micah's really good. Yeah. Like the crawling things of the earth, they shall come trembling out of their strongholds, and they shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you. And then it moves right into that last section. Who is a God like you? And so you bring all this garden, serpent, curse imagery brought together by the shepherd king who is coming. Wow. The nations who rebel are going to lick the dust like the serpent. And how does that all come about? Well, it's the Genesis 3:15 promise in seed form here in Micah of the mutual affliction, right? He's going to bite your heel, but you will crush his head, which we know is what happens on the cross of Christ. The shepherd king who comes and lays down his life as the good shepherd for the sheep. And it's just a really beautiful, there's lots of rich imagery that points us forward to that day.
Yeah. So this is the halfway point.
Yes.
We've made it through 6, and many commentators kind of clump these 6 together, kind of a 6, ending with Micah in like part 1 of the book.
Yeah.
And then we have 2 sections of 3 coming,
Yep.
Culminating in Malachi. And so, like, the table is set. And so what historically is moving us, maybe in preparation for next week? Like, where are we going?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. There are moments of hope here in these front sections. I mean, we just read that. I mean, that section's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I will tell you, those moments start to drop off a little bit more.
It gets darker.
It does get
darker before it gets better.
Yeah. Like, one thing maybe is a good reminder. It's really cool in Jeremiah 26. Jeremiah actually references, the people reference Micah. So Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, very unpopular, dealt with a lot of false prophets, right? They all wanted to preach peace and prosperity and security, and Jeremiah's like, that's not what the Lord has said. Yeah. So you get to Jeremiah 26, and they're literally want to kill him. And then it says this in 17, certain of the elders of the land arose and spoke to the assembled people, saying, Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and said to all the people, thus says the Lord of hosts, and then he quotes chapter 3, verse 12 of Micah. Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. And then it says this, did Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all Judah put him to death? Did he not fear the Lord and entreat the favor of the Lord? And did not the Lord relent of the disaster that he had pronounced against them? But we are about to bring great disaster upon ourselves. Yeah. So they actually say, well, we probably shouldn't kill Jeremiah because remember Micah. Like, we actually listened to what he said, at least Judah did, and the Lord relented for a season from disaster. And so Micah is kind of, there's still a bit of hope that's there. And there is hope in the second half, but really the next section is going to deal more with God's judgment on the nations. Yeah. I mean, Nahum, is an intense book. There's another word for Assyria, for the nations that are out there. And so there's a judgment from the Lord, even though he is in his sovereignty using the nations to discipline his people. He still holds them accountable for the way they act. And really the next 3 books are going to get really into that. And then the last 3 are looking forward. If Micah's talking about a remnant, it's looking forward past the destruction of the temple, past Judah's final downfall to, okay, how do you now live in the midst of this faithless age, now when you're even in exile, when you're not in the land, when you've been stripped away from the benefits of having a king and having the prophets? I mean, Micah is the forerunner to 400 years of silence before John the Baptist comes. And so the tone just shifts a little bit of, okay, how, for those who have ears to hear, right, for those who might, like in this circumstance, listen to the prophets, how do we live in the midst of exile? How do we live in the midst of underneath God's judgment, but also long for those beautiful promises of what is to come? Because God, as we had the benediction this morning, well, spoiler, when we're recording this, he is faithful. He will surely do it. He will preserve a remnant. What he says will come true. And so there are moments of hope in the midst of just, let's take stock of the Lord is serious about his word. We're now in exile. There's judgment that has come. So we need to long and look forward with a faithfulness in everyday living to that day that's coming.
Amen. And there's always an invitation we've seen here in the first half of the book of the 12 to return to the Lord, who will pardon the iniquity of those who return to him in humility. So thanks, brother. Looking forward to continuing on